So since late June, I've been working at 350 doing a research project where I originally was looking to campaign finances for several elected members of New Hampshire's Senate and state houses. And the results of the investigation have informed this presentation. So that led me on to a lot of different angles where there's a lot of different ways dark money is infiltrating into the state and impacting the way that climate policy is conducted in the state. So I found that dark money traced to utilities and fossil fuel companies have been seeping into New Hampshire, ensuring that self-interest in the legislature and governor's office have blocked the state's progression to an equitable green transition. So I'm going to begin with the New England Ratepayers Association, or NERA, who describe themselves as a ratepayer advocacy group, though we shall see that they're in fact funded by the fossil fuel industry. We're then going to move on to the Sununu family, discussing their historical and continuing corrosive impact on climate policy at both the state and the federal level. I'm then going to continue with talking about the members of the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee and their impact on the state side of things. Then I'm going to end with the DCI group, who's a DC-based international lobbying outfit whose main clients have been ExxonMobil and the United States coal industry, who have recently reared their heads in the state. So as I said, we're going to be starting with NERA, or the New England Ratepayers Association. And the main actors in this section will be Mark Brown, Mike Harrington, and Michael Sununu. So what is NERA? Well, in their own words, as described in the 2015 New Hampshire Policy Brief, they describe themselves as a nonprofit advocacy group focused on promoting sound public policy that protects both utility customers, families, and businesses, and lowers the cost of regulated services. They say that every effort should be made to ensure that the Merrimack Station coal plant remain in operation, and they're against the Renewable Portfolio Standards, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, Energy Efficiency Resource Program, and net metering. So basically anything that involves renewable energy. While they are for increasing methane gas electricity generators and increased methane gas pipeline capacity in both New England and in New Hampshire. So NERA was established in Massachusetts in 2013 by a former ice cream shop owner and restaurant manager named Mark Brown. It immediately became involved with the Massachusetts Cape Wind project and worked with the fossil fuel industry to shut down the project that was to build a bunch of offshore wind off the coast of the Cape. In a local magazine that was reporting right from when this was going on, the NERA was described as, quote, a new mysterious Cape Wind foe. And through their efforts, as we know, the Cape Wind project was ended and no offshore wind was able to be built in Massachusetts. In that same year, Mark Brown sent a letter to the Federal Energy Committee in the United States House, lobbying for increased methane gas pipelines into New England. So NERA's operating structure is very interesting, and this is how they conduct a lot of their influence in politics. So its founder and director is Mark Brown, who concurrently served as a consultant and lobbyist for NH Government Affairs, representing auto manufacturers, private prisons, and AT&T, among other clients. And while claiming to be a ratepayer advocacy group, research by Public Citizen, which is a nonprofit, reveals that it is actually a corporate trade association, and it only has 15 members. So they claim that their members are families and local businesses. However, only 10 companies paid $20,000 annually to be a member at NERA, while a further 5 companies paid $5,000 in a 2-tier membership structure typical of trade associations. So Public Citizen, working backwards for this information that was shown in their tax returns, reveal that they actually are working for a very small group of people, or not people, companies like utilities and fossil fuel companies. So I'm going to be talking about 2 case studies about how NERA has been working as an undemocratic agent that's been actually foiling bipartisan compromises in the state that have progressed climate policy.
starting with the net metering controversy in 2016 to 2018. So in 2016, a bipartisan net metering bill, and net metering is this mechanism where utilities pay people or small businesses who have solar or wind arrays on their property. So they get paid monthly for the amount of energy that they put into the overall grid system. And this means that people who are producing renewable energy don't need to use the renewable energy that they produce, just fed onto the grid, which encourages the further development of solar and wind energy, as it isn't too onerous for people to install it and use it. So in 2016, a net metering bill sponsored by both Republicans and Democrats was signed by Maggie Hassan. And this bill explicitly recognized the importance for New Hampshire to achieve energy independence through local renewable energy resources. And it provided a market framework for encouraging investment in green energy and production. The bill or the law tasked the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission, which is in charge of overseeing and regulating utilities, to begin its task of deciding how to alter net metering and to respond to these new goals. What should have been a very technocratic exercise immediately became very political, as the commission had broad authority to change the structure of net metering, and through this authority, they could either completely erase net metering or keep it the way it was. So this was referred to docket DE 16573 or 576. So the three New Hampshire utilities companies joined the legal proceedings, along with the Office of the Consumer Advocate and 7 other interested parties, including NERA. The 3 people representing NERA were Mark Brown, who was the director, Michael Sununu, the brother of Chris Sununu, and Mike Harrington, who was then and is still currently a member of the New Hampshire House. So there was a lot of legal wrangling going on in these discussions, but these parties split into 2 coalitions. Utilities and Consumers Coalition, the court called them the UCC, and these were the utilities, the fossil fuel companies, and NERA. Then the Energy Future Coalition, or the EFC, and these were the green energy advocates, the renewable companies, and then the nonprofits that support equitable green transition. So the utilities and NERA essentially argued that net metering was not great because it supposedly caused an adverse effect on other ratepayers in the grid who do not have renewable energy, saying that these people were subsidizing the energy that was produced by people who had renewable arrays. While the green groups argued that there was no proof that net metering had a negative effect on other ratepayers' bills, and they advocated for a slow transition in regulations from current ones, going from the current regulations that encouraged growth and the building of infrastructure for renewables into a more sustainable market structure that supported existing net metering customers. An independent expert commissioned by the commission favored this green renewables position, saying that there should be more of a status quo and more support for net metering. Also finding that there was insignificant data supporting the claims that net metering impacted people who did not have renewable energy. However, the utilities group NERA sought to undermine the position of this report, which was written by Stan Framiez, arguing that he was biased in favor of the renewable energy advocates. NERA tipped the scales into the utilities' favor, as the commission gave their views weight due to their status as a, quote, consumer advocacy group. As the commission wrote in their final order, we believe the balance tips in favor of the UCC, which is the utilities' proposal on this point, supported by the diverse interests of the OCA, other consumer advocacy groups, and the utilities. But we are not convinced that that 0 is the appropriate result. So here, because NERA portrays themselves as working in the interests of all ratepayers, the families and small businesses who actually are paying the utilities their bills, the commission found that their arguments were very convincing. However, as we already determined, NERA does not work and they do not support the interests of individuals and small businesses. They are actually just a front organization for the utilities companies. So the utilities were basically being represented by themselves, confusing the court on whose interest NERA was actually serving, and thus achieving the result that net metering was cut in 2018. So to summarize, NERA successfully diluted a bipartisan piece of state legislation, which would have grown the solar industry, masquerading as representatives of the interests of families and small businesses, when in fact they represent big utilities and dirty energy companies. NERA repeated this exact same tactic in 2017 in Maine, getting involved as a ratepayer advocate during the state legislature's discussion of their bill OD 1373, which was an act to protect and expand access to solar power in Maine. And they successfully stopped its advance using the same argument that increasing renewable energy actually harmed the everyday ratepayer because it would increase their electricity prices. The second case study we're going to be discussing is the biomass fight in 2018. So in that year, Senate Bill 365 passed in a Republican-controlled General Court, and it actually override Chris Sununu's veto, becoming RSA 362H. And this law mandated that utility companies purchase power from biomass plants at below market rates. And the reason this was done is because the forestry industry in New Hampshire provides a lot of jobs to the state and has a lot of grassroots power amongst the senators, both Democratic and Republican. However, utilities companies did not like this bill because it forced them to pay more energy to these biomass burning power plant companies, while they would rather have just purchased their power from the coal and gas plants that are their typical customers. So they had their front group, NERA, immediately file a suit with both the New Hampshire Public Utilities Commission and FERC, which is the federal commission that oversees utilities and energy. And Mark Brown and Michael Sununu were present at these legal proceedings. NERA eventually succeeded in FERC, infuriating state Republicans like Senate Jeb Bradley, who was then the Senate Majority Leader, and overriding law that had been passed pretty much unanimously by both houses of the legislature. So through legal action, NERA successfully achieved the aims of Sununu's veto, even though his veto was overrode, bypassing the democratic process. And I think that this action is even more flagrant considering that Chris Sununu's brother Michael was in the courtroom, making sure that this was actually achieved. So just to demonstrate how callous they were in this involvement, this is a bit of a transcript from one of these legal proceedings. One of the lawyers from one of the biomass plants had objected to NERA's lawsuit because the lawyer's objection was that NERA did not actually represent ratepayers, because their only members are utilities and dirty energy companies. The way NERA got away from, or got around these accusations is when the chairman asked if they have members who are Eversource ratepayers, Mark Brown responded yes, as in he himself is an Eversource ratepayer. And then the chair asked if Michael Sununu was also an Eversource ratepayer, and Mark Brown responded in the affirmative for that as well. So the only thing that this transcript shows is that the only two people who are actually Eversource ratepayers who are represented by the New England Ratepayers Association are the two people who head NERA, and that's Mark Brown and Michael Sununu. Another very worrying connection between NERA and the Sununu family is this subsidiary organization that shares the same address with NERA, called the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund. In 2018, Mark Brown, along with James and Michael Sununu, and state reps Michael Harrington and Michael Vose, formed the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund. And this fund operated as a funneling mechanism to fund the legal pursuits that NERA was conducting. And this was right when this biomass dispute was happening at the federal level, and also was making its way through state courts. So as I said, their principal business address was the same, both as NERA's and also as Sununu Enterprises, the family's lobbying office, which Chris Sununu worked for until joining the executive council, and which Michael and James Sununu continued to work for. This fund functioned to connect all anti-climate interests in New Hampshire, joining NERA, the Sununu family, state reps together into a single forum. Jeffrey Mitchell, the only other board member who was not one of these groups, was a lobbying partner for Grant Energy, which worked for the utility and gas companies. So NEAR's playbook, just to reiterate, is portraying itself as a ratepayer organization representing low-income families, while also actively pursuing pro-utilities, pro-Sununu, and an anti-climate agenda. NEAR has successfully overrode the state legislature's will, even when bipartisan majorities come together to overcome Sununu's veto. While currently dormant, NEAR demonstrates how powerful dark money lobbyists are in our state. So now I'm going to be talking about the Sununu dynasty, who both historically and currently are foiling the green energy transition, both at a state and a federal level. So first, some background, and I will let the Sununu speak for themselves. When John H. Sununu, who was the family patriarch and the father of Michael, Chris, and James Sununu, was Bush Sr.'s chief of staff back in the 90s, he said, quote, "I don't want anyone in this administration without a scientific background using, quote, climate change or global warming ever again." And this was in a memo to the West Wing as in his capacity as chief of staff. Michael Sununu, in a report for the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, which is a Koch brothers funded right-wing policy institute, wrote, quote, "Among the many drivers of unsound public policy in this day and age, perhaps the most odious is the alarmism over changes in climate that are supposedly driven by human activity. Climate change science is based on flimsy evidence, exaggerated claims, and a profound ignorance of the natural evolution and cycles of our climate systems." And finally, our governor, Chris Sununu, responding to a journalist's question about whether or not he believes in climate change, said, quote, "I don't know for sure. Is carbon the leading reason why the Earth has warmed up pretty much continuously over the last 150 years? I'm not so sure. It could be." So John H. Sununu, the father of the Sununu brothers, was formerly the chief of staff for George H.W. Bush. And in a very well-researched New York Times Magazine article, he was accredited with sinking the first international climate conference in the Netherlands in 1989. And if the United States had actually participated in this climate conference, we would have been decades ahead on pursuing the green energy transition. Instead, he instituted a culture of fear amongst government scientists who felt that they could not speak the truth about climate change. And many government scientists in both NASA and other agencies were actually prohibited from discussing climate change with the Senate committees when they were called to give expert testimony. And the censorship was directed directly by John H. Sununu. He was and still is the largest single shareholder and board member of Anglo-Asian Mining, which is an Azerbaijani minerals miner accused of war profiteering during the recent Azeri-Armenian War back in 2020. And he was also formerly an associate dean of MIT's engineering school, even though he has been a consistent climate denier. Chris Sununu has explicitly denied climate change early into his governorship up till now. He has very cozy ties to energy and utility companies, and he's repeatedly vetoed bipartisan renewable bills, such as those which increase net metering capacity, like the ones passed in 2018 and 2019. And he refuses to sign bipartisan bills like the one this year that created low-income community solar programs, even though that bill had a veto-proof majority. So just on principle, he refused to sign that bill that gave funding to create low-income community solar programs. And in just this electoral session, he has raised to date $93,780 from dirty fossil fuel interests. As governor, he is the only New England governor not to sign on to the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is effectively states signing on to the Paris Climate Accords. He's refused to join the Transport and Climate Initiative, which is an interstate agreement to reduce carbon emissions from vehicles through a carbon trade and capture mechanism. And he appoints members of the Public Utility Commission, who last November rejected an expansion of the New Hampshire Saves program and attempted to cut energy efficiency program, a move that eventually had to be backtracked after fierce resistance. And lastly, Chris Sununu's brother, Michael Sununu, is a consultant and lobbyist whose clients are, from his LinkedIn, large corporations and medium-sized firms in the energy and infrastructure industries, including major electrical utilities. He's, as we've seen, collaborated with Mark Brown and NERA on many of their legal battles. And in 2017, he wrote a 24-page report for the Koch-funded Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, lambasting the New Hampshire Coastal Risk and Hazard Commission report on climate change risk factors for New Hampshire's seacoast. So through these three Sununus, New Hampshire has seen stagnation in their renewable energy goals. Due to the Sununu's influence over New Hampshire politics and their radical stance against climate change, the state has lagged behind other New England states on climate action and green energy. While New Hampshire residents suffer the consequences with high energy prices, the Sununus continue to take donations and receive consulting fees from utilities and fossil fuel companies. All right, so we're roughly around the halfway point. So now we'll take a couple of questions if anyone has them before we go on to the next part.
If anyone else has a question, feel free to put it in the chat, or you can put an asterisk in the chat and we'll call on you. But I have a question while we wait for any others to roll in. And that is, you mentioned the Josiah Bartlett Center there. Could you expand on what that group is?
Yeah, so it's a very right-wing policy research group that's been funded by the Koch brothers and the Koch industry, and they're heavily associated with this network of anti-climate groups such as NERA and the DCI group, and have worked with companies such as ExxonMobil to scupper a lot of climate legislation going back to 2003.
From the chat, I'll just read this out loud for everyone to hear. Does NERA still exist? If not, what organization seems to have replaced it?
So NERA technically still exists in that they continue to file for nonprofit status, though it seems as if they have been dormant since 2020 after they were pretty much exposed for who their membership was by Public Citizen. But Mark Brown is still an active lobbyist in the state of New Hampshire. He is in the he's the regional director for another right-wing anti-climate nonprofit, which name is eluding me right now. I think it's later on in the presentation.
I'm just going to read the next question from the chat. What is 350 New Hampshire's strategy for using this info when canvassing?
Yes, and I will definitely get into this at the end, but we have a campaign against all the climate deniers in New Hampshire. So we're actively campaigning against the people currently in office who have been climate deniers, while also supporting the people running against them as climate champions. So we've been canvassing in areas where these people, their constituencies, as well as we have a website and we've been posting on social media and having ads. And we also have opportunities for people to volunteer for these activities.
If any of the other 350 New Hampshire folks on the call want to add to that particular question, feel free. I'll just add briefly that the intricacies of like the utility bill increase have been a really important topic at Doors and just generally speaking. And one thing that we're doing, I think October 27th. We're having a utility rate hike town hall in Concord. So I think there'll be more information about how that plays in as well. Let's do one more question maybe, and then the second part of the presentation, and then if your question did not get answered, we can come back to it at the second question asking point. Have you kept a record of legislators' votes on key climate bills?
Yes, not exhaustive. So a lot of these legislators have been in office since 2012. I've been tracking it for the past like 2 years, 4 sessions. But there's also a lot of other journalists or people who have had a lot more exhaustive lists. All right, I'm gonna grab one more sip of water. And then, okay, so now I'm going to be talking about the New Hampshire climate deniers who are elected representatives in the House Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. So first, there's Michael Vose. He's the chair of this STE committee, and this committee is where all bills originate that regulate our electric grid, and he sponsors the most anti-climate legislation. He's a close collaborator with the Sununu family, as we saw with his involvement with NERA and the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund. He's served on boards of both the Ratepayers Legal Defense Fund and worked as an expert witness for NERA receiving funds from Mark Brown. In a blog post, he has blamed wind turbines for causing climate change, though in a later post, he also described or said that climate change wasn't real to begin with. Fred Plett has been a House Rep serving since 2018 in the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee. Before running, Plett was a director and assistant to the president at the forerunner company to Eversource, and he also has broad exposure to utilities companies. He was vice chair of NEPOOL, which is their trade association, a consultant for the Electric Power Institute, and director for the Northeast Power Coordinating Council. He currently is the only employee of Sapiens Energy Advisors, LLC, which is his own energy policy consulting firm, and he writes many of the bills that come out of the STE using his experience within the industry. And here, what is of note is that his full-time job is being paid to consult firms on state energy policy, while he is actually the one writing energy policy in the state. So there's very clearly a conflict of interest between the concerns of his clients in his private capacity and his role as a public servant. Mike Harrington is the most scientific of all of these people in the committee. He is a bachelor's in science and nuclear energy, working at Seabrook Nuclear Power Station for 22 years. He served on the Public Utilities Commission, first as a policy advisor and then as a commissioner. And he first became a representative and joined the committee in 2016. He started Harrington Consultants right after his term as commissioner was over, consulting on, quote, energy and regulatory issues, much like Fred Plett. He's also formerly a board member of the RLDF and has the closest working relationship with Mark Brown, providing testimony during the net metering controversy in 2016 and standing by in many of these hearings that NERA was a part of. So again, his full-time job is consulting on state energy and regulatory issues, while he was a former regulator and a current writer of the laws regulating energy. Next, there's Janine Nodder. She's been a House Rep since 2010 and is currently serving as the Chief Majority Whip in the House, which is the third highest position after the Speaker and the Majority Leader. Even though she raises less than $500 each campaign cycle, she still receives a couple $100 a term from fossil fuel interests. And she hosts a community TV show where she espouses climate denialism along with other right-wing scientific falsehoods. And I'm going to play a little clip of one of these programs.
Well, you know, who the squeaky wheel gets the grease. You've heard that. So we have one group of scientists who are the squeaky wheel, and they get the grease. Everyone knows their side. But there are tens of thousands of scientists in the world that disagree. No, they might not disagree that, yeah, the climate's changing. It's always changing. And this is nothing new. This goes back for centuries, the climate changing, where we have warmer periods and colder periods. What they disagree on is how much effect we're having on it. Now, I spent the first 7 years of my life breathing smog. I run marathons. So, and the air in New Hampshire is so much better. It's so much better. I don't know why anybody would want to spend all that money and tax us to death to fix a problem that is so small and would have such a little effect.
Well, you're right. New Hampshire's contribution to any amount of pollution is so infinitesimally small compared to the country, and more importantly, compared to the rest of the world. You know, the U.S. is only responsible for approximately 15% of the CO2 emissions of the entire world. You put Europe and China and India together, and they pollute much more. And so our contribution contributes very little to whatever improvement that the world body wants. But the expense that is being used to put us into the category is really one reason why our energy prices are so high. There are other reasons too, of a more current nature, which we can get into later. But it is a lot of money being spent for very little return. And I believe that there is a happy medium. You know, we can live with the new type of energy, the new renewable energies. I think we have a place for that. We should have a place for that. They should be used, but I don't think that they can be used 100% of the time.
Oh, they absolutely can't. In fact, okay, I have this page marked. Replacing 4 conventional power plants would necessitate a wind farm the size of Rhode Island. So wind, of course, is one source of energy. To replace all conventional power plants require land larger than the state of California. So that was just one thing. So wind is one source of energy. You know, they have to, where do they get the parts to build it? See, there's all these questions that don't get answered. How long do they last? What do you do with them when they're no longer in service? Can they be recycled? Then we have solar. So, I mean, how reliable is solar? If the sun's not shining, is it producing?
Well, that's right.
Snow, if they're dirty, if it's too hot, you know, 70 degrees is the best temperature for solar power.
Right. Solar works fine on a limited basis.
All right, so that was Janine Otter with Doug Thomas, the last member of the committee that we're going to be discussing. And that clip, ignoring the video quality, was actually from this year back in March, which I think is just astonishing that that rhetoric is still being deployed in the public space. So Doug Thomas is the relative moderate out of all these people that we've been discussing. He served on the United States Air Force and then worked in the military industrial complex for 29 years, and he's been in this committee since 2014. He blames electricity bill increases on coal scrubber requirements and net metering, and he accepts that climate change exists in principle and supports renewables in concept, but he still votes the same as the other climate deniers. So through their control of the Science, Technology, and Energy Committee, these climate deniers have been able to block most climate-related legislation and impose their own harmful bills. For instance, a bill sponsored by Fred Plett stated that no country, town, city shall restrict or prohibit types of fuel sources of energy production which may be used, delivered, converted, or supplied to customers. And this was amended and passed back in May. And this was to ensure that smaller municipalities in New Hampshire couldn't restrict fossil fuel from being burned or produced in their town or their jurisdiction. Another bill passed this year was sponsored by Vose and Notter, and it creates red tape for selling renewable energy certificates, making municipal solar and wind projects more expensive and less economical. with one renewable energy advocate describing it as the death knell of the renewable energy in New Hampshire. And this was passed back in June. The last section and the last group that I'm going to be discussing is the DCI group. And this is a more recent phenomenon occurring in New Hampshire, which is the arrival of this international lobbying firm. So the DCI group has had a long history of involvement with big oil and coal. So from 2003 to 2005, they led the ExxonMobil funded campaign against the McLean-Lieberman Climate Stewardship and Innovation Acts. And these acts were a series of bills that almost passed through the Senate and House back in 2003, which would have created a very rigorous carbon trading and system, which would have put us on track for carbon neutrality 20 years from where we are today. In 2006, the DCI group hosted the strategic discussion regarding the Clean Air Act at their DC offices, and inviting many ExxonMobil funded nonprofits. And the Josiah Bartlett Center was at this meeting. And this was a meeting among a bunch of right-wing anti-climate groups discussing how to mitigate or scupper the Clean Air Act. And in 2012 to 2016, their biggest client was the American Coalition for Clean Coal Electricity. And they were actually the group to create the marketing around clean coal. And they received around 8.18 million in fees. Other notable clients for this group are a bunch of other very unsavory groups and people. For instance, Ian Plus Group, which is a Russian mining and energy company, which is under United States sanctions. Malaysian Palm Oil Council, and the brief of the DCI group included to counter accusations that palm oil caused rainforest deforestation. The mine company of Kantakonga, which is the cobalt miner in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, owned by Moise Katumbi, who was described by The Economist as the second most powerful person in the DCR and accused of formulating a coup in the country. And lastly, Alvaro Uribe, who's a former Colombian president who's been credibly accused of crimes against humanity for atrocities against FARC, which is the left-wing guerrilla group that formerly waged a civil war in Colombia. So the reason we're discussing this group, who's had a broad range of national and international controversies, is because beginning in late March, partners and executives of the DCI group donated significant sums into Governor Sununu's re-election campaign, raising questions as to their motivations. So from March 28th to August 24th, Sununu raised $18,250 in individual donations from the group. And this was in relatively early days of his fundraising campaign. So even though that doesn't seem like too much money in proportion, it was around 15 to 20% of his total intake early on in the year. These were also the only donations the DCI group made to any state level race anywhere in the country. Which leads to the question, why are they interested in New Hampshire state politics? And pictured here is Craig Stevens, the only member of the DCI group who is based in New Hampshire, and he moves between Meredith and Washington, D.C. So attempting to discover why DCI groups is in New Hampshire and what their intentions are, I filed a right to know request with the governor's office for any material relating to the group or their agents. And after months of delays, I finally received documents from the Sununu's legal counsel, and it revealed a campaign led by Craig Stevens, who is the DCI partner in New Hampshire, where he was attempting and succeeded in placing himself on Sununu's newly formed Cryptocurrencies and Digital Assets Commission. Stevens had sent numerous emails to Sununu's office nominating himself for a place in this task force on February 12th. On March 24th, Sununu announced the task force with Stevens as one of its members. And on March 28th, the first campaign donation from a DCI group agent was given, seeming like it's a pretty good connection that there was some kind of quid pro quo where Stevens said that money would flow in after it was announced that he would be on this task force. While it's still unknown what DCI Group's exact interest is in crypto regulation in New Hampshire, one possibility might be connected to Atlas Holdings, the private equity group that holds numerous dirty energy assets in New Hampshire, most notably the coal power plant Merrimack Station up in Vose. So Atlas Holdings has a history of converting its power plants into cryptocurrency mining facilities, most notably in upstate New York. And it is possible that they're contemplating a similar transition for their coal plant in Vose. And this coal plant is the last coal plant in New England, and 350 New Hampshire is actually conducting a campaign with no gas, trying to shut down this coal plant for good, even as groups are trying to turn it into either a natural gas fired plant or seemingly a cryptocurrency miner. While at this time, there is no public connection between the DCI group and Atlas Holdings, it seems likely that the group is advocating on either their or similar companies' interest, as they abuse campaign donations in order to achieve a say on the state's crypto regulations. So to conclude my presentation, it's been established that dark money rules are climate politics. Fossil fuel interests are represented over the interests of everyday people in New Hampshire, and democratic processes are squashed in favor for these dark and very shady organizations and their legal routes. Self-interest and greed from Nira, the Sununu family, and climate-denying reps rule energy policy in New Hampshire. Despite broad public opinion, which says New Hampshire residents want the government to do something about climate change, New Hampshire is way behind the other New England states. We need climate action now, and that means getting dark money out of our politics and electing progressive climate champions. So 350 New Hampshire Action is leading a campaign against these climate deniers, pushing for climate champions to replace them this November. We need your support to get these people out of office, whether it be volunteering or donating to us if you're unable to volunteer. Also, please go to our website, which is www.newhampshireclimatedeniers.org, to learn more about the climate deniers and also to nominate other climate deniers who might be your own reps who are involved with New Hampshire politics. And that link will be sent in the chat. And finally, does anyone have any questions about anything I said?
Also, if you had a question earlier that we missed, would appreciate if you could just re-ask it in the chat if it's still a question, or if you want to put an asterisk in the chat. And I think we have a question from Micha.
Yeah, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
So I realize this isn't exactly a privatization scheme that we're talking about, but it reeks of something very similar to that. And I wonder what you guys have in terms of talking about this. I understand the climate change issue is hugely, hugely important, no disagreement. But in terms of knocking on doors, if we can focus on talking about this in terms of public expense for private profit, just like in a privatization scheme, which I think is what's going on here, I think that would be helpful. The idea that these players that Matthew has been talking about are basically hiring the government to grab money from people and put it in private hands.
Yeah, I think definitely it's a very good angle to go through with, no one loves seeing corruption in their politics, and looking at the way money is flowing to individuals and interests are being served. I think it's very clear that the people who are advocating for fossil fuel interests are not advocating that out of any kind of public service. And we definitely have in our promotional material and in our campaign a discussion of this corruption going on in New Hampshire politics.
One question from the chat, and Cynthia, if I'm mischaracterizing this, I'm sort of summarizing some of the things that you've written here. Do we have any numbers on what the energy costs would be for Granite Staters if we had actually moved towards renewable energy, and like how can we talk about that issue with people if we're canvassing?
Yeah, it's impossible to calculate it for New Hampshire specifically, just because we don't know. I mean, you can model it, but I'm not an economist. I think the easiest way to figure out what the actual impact is to compare New Hampshire's energy market to our neighbors who have been pursuing a more equitable green transition. So if you take Vermont, for example, which has been pushing heavily into renewables, including hydro, solar, and wind, I believe renewables account for around 70% of their energy profile right now, with the rest being taken up by nuclear. And the way the Vermont market works is that they're capped at about 17 cents per megawatt hour. And that's total. Whereas in New Hampshire, the electric price, there's the kilowatt hour price, as well as the distribution fee, the transmission fee, and a bunch of other fees. In Vermont, the complete price is just around 17 cents, where in New Hampshire, pretty sure on the spot market, after the rise in methane, natural gas, after Ukraine, hovering around 24, 25 cents. And in total, it's something north of 40 cents. And New Hampshire on the spot market is the second most expensive energy in the United States, right after Hawaii. And I don't have the numbers specifically for Maine, but it'd be very interesting to compare Maine's energy market to New Hampshire's, because Maine was in a pretty similar situation as New Hampshire back in 2012, where there wasn't very much interest in pursuing a green energy policy. However, they started pursuing renewables, and they now have a lot of infrastructure off of their coast for offshore wind. And they have a bunch of plans for reaching net neutrality. And their energy is certainly cheaper than ours, but it would be interesting to see just how much cheaper it is.
I'll make sure we share those numbers in our follow-up email from this presentation for you all as well. The next question is, what are we doing to get out the vote in New Hampshire?
Yep, so we're canvassing, we're going person in person, knocking on doors, distributing literature and talking to people, as well as we have texting campaigns and calling campaigns to get out the vote. And let me know if I missed any things that we're doing. I mean, social media too.
Yeah, and we have some people writing letters to the editor about some of our candidates. Yeah, if you want to join us at doors or phones, Lisa put the link in the chat for everyone. The next question, does there exist any concrete evidence of Chris Sununu benefiting monetarily from this network of dark money interlaced with New Hampshire political and legislative outcomes? Does he gain more than just power and position?
There's no smoking gun of ExxonMobil depositing money into his bank account. However, in his campaign finances, he receives a bunch of money from these utilities, specifically Eversource, which hosts a lot of events for him. And his campaign then goes on to expense figures in the tens of thousands of dollars to people like his brothers and his sisters-in-law for work that they do on the campaign. So indirectly, money that is put in by these dirty energy groups goes out into group members of the Sununu family, just not specifically Chris Sununu.
We have a couple questions related to media, like can these findings be published in Concord Monitor, or is there enough going on to invite the Boston Globe Spotlight team in to investigate? And I can take this one. We invited several reporters to come join us tonight, and I think a couple who we're going to send the recording to after. Most of this information that you found, Matthew, right, was through just like these people's campaign finance documents, and so it's easily, well, not easily, but it's accessible by the general public. So we're hoping to get some of these media outlets to cover this. Yeah, Matthew, do you want to say a little bit more about all your sources?
Yeah, so as I said, I started with the records with the New Hampshire Secretary of State that has all campaign donations. And from there, I went through, first Dave Anderson did a big piece about NERA in 2020. detailing the organization and exactly what they've been doing. And then there's a bunch of other public records in all those legal cases that they've been a part of. All those legal documents that I had screenshotted are part of the public record. So what the nonprofit Public Citizen, their research was in the form of a legal amicus brief that they had submitted. So through all these documents, they kind of interlinked with each other and are cross-sited, creating like a web of resources. And then the last bit of information that the only thing that isn't in the public domain that they used is the right to know request that I submitted with Sununu's office, where I got the information regarding the DCI group getting onto the cryptocurrencies platform. But now that we have those documents, we can share and publicize them.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question that you would like to ask? Is there anyone else from the 315 Hampshire team who is here, who has anything that they would like to add?
Hey, Lisa here. I'm one of the co-executive directors of 350 New Hampshire and 350 New Hampshire Action. It's my job to ask you to donate to us. We just had a monthly donor drive that was focusing on our monthly donations to the C4, which funds Matthew's work, which funds Sarah's work, who's on here, and Dominic, who's going to be staying on as our electoral organizer. We have an election coming up right now for November 8th. So again, get involved with us that way. But part of the way that we need our help and support from you is for monthly donations to our work. I'll put the link to donate in here and ask for Rebecca to have it in the email that gets sent out. But even a one-time donation makes a difference. We are really looking to support the work that Matthew and others have been doing this year and get ready for, let's see who comes through for the 2024 presidential election and then also municipal elections. And that's my pitch, so please donate.
Thanks, Lisa. It looks like we haven't got any other questions. Yeah, if anyone thinks of questions, also feel free to email one of us. Matthew's email is right here if you want to ask about his research. I will send a follow-up email to everyone who signed up tonight with the recording, as well as some of the links that were dropped in the chat, as well as the source information for this presentation and some more numbers and info for you all about the utility rate hike issue. Yes, I can also include a link to the slides in that. Cool. Thank you so much to everyone who came. Thank you, Matthew, for all of this work. And I hope everyone has a good evening.